I'm only into episode 3 of Climate Matters and my focus has expanded. I set out to try and understand the elements of climate and thought I would be focusing on the facts and the science of carbon and methane and the impact of solar fluctuations and so on. While that remains much of the focus of the show, I've already heard from viewers that the conversation does indeed need to be expanded to include a wide range of elements that include, yes, climate, but the environment and societal values. And one of those societal values is how our organizations responding to climate change. It struck me that no matter what you think of or know about the science, organizations need to be responding to the issue of climate change. Failure to do so means those organizations may end up offside with their customers who are also voters. The connection, of course, is those voters elect politicians who establish laws and regulations that force changes in manufacturing and use. So no matter what you think about climate change, the business climate is changing and your organization better change as well. As Mark Carney says, failure to address the issue may very well strand assets. Coal, oil, and gas can lose value as the push to move away from carbon-based fuels grows. He says trillions of dollars of investments may be sequestered with the carbon-based resources they fund. The tech frontier oil sands cancellation is an example of how the business community, while attempting to respond to environmental issues, ultimately determined the biggest climate change was the uncertainty that comes from a lack of clear-cut policies and regulations. The company walked away from a $20 billion investment, and in doing so suggested the market for resource development in Canada is drying up. In this episode, I sit down with Professor Justin Bull of the Sauder School of Business, who focuses much of his energy on why and how companies are forced to face the climate change issue. Joining me today is Justin Bull, who is a professor at the Sauder School of Business out at the University of British Columbia. And you specialize in looking at how companies respond to climate change. And when we first started talking, I thought, okay, well, what can they do? Why is it important? How, and so on. And I came to realize companies have to respond to climate change. Otherwise, they're going to be out of business. And whether that's them doing something directly that affects climate or indirectly through their actions have a ripple effect. This has to be front of mind. How important is it that a company understand their responsibility in responding to climate?
I think it's vitally important, and there's a built-in tension around this, because the larger your impact on the climate is, the harder it is for you to take responsibility for that impact. And so the more likely you are to find reasons why you shouldn't. Versus, let's say, the tech sector. Like Google, Apple, Amazon, Facebook, all progressive claims around we're going to go carbon neutral by 2030. This was Amazon's, or Microsoft's rather, a big proclamation just a couple weeks ago. We're going carbon neutral. It's a lot easier for Microsoft to go carbon neutral than Suncor.
Is it?
Yeah, because their business, the majority of their environmental footprint is associated primarily with either their office spaces or the data centers they operate. Okay. And so you can measure the footprint of an office space, its energy requirements, the HVAC, the water, whatever it might be, and you can do everything you can to either use renewable energy or meet some kind of green building standard in order to have a very sustainable building. And similarly, for a data center, you can say, look, I know my data center consumes X number of gigawatts an hour, and I can go into the market and either directly purchase and operate my own renewable energy infrastructure, which many of these large organizations are doing, or I can buy someone else's renewable energy credits and to get credit for everything I'm doing. So those are companies that sit on this one end of the spectrum where I'm not trying to diminish their efforts, but the reason they can show climate leadership is it requires less sacrifice on their part.
Yeah, well, almost none.
Right? And on the other side, there's companies who to show climate leadership is obviously much more difficult. And we've seen, I think, in Canada, in just the last 12 months, almost a sea change in the attitude of the corporate sector in terms of embracing the climate crisis.
Well, I think you're absolutely right. I was in a conversation with Jimmy Pattison a couple of weeks ago, and he said, 10 years ago, we didn't talk about climate.
Yeah.
He said, now every meeting I go to, it's on the agenda.
Yeah. Well, the reason it's on the agenda is that business creates value, and in order to create value in the long term, it must manage risk. And business leaders, and whether in academia or in the C-suite, are starting to understand that changes in climate, whether they're actual ecological changes to the function of planetary and weather systems,
right,
or whether they're changes in regulation, changes in political atmosphere, changes in social appetites, changes in the expectations of their employees and their talent, changes in the expectations of the investors. All of these have
and
risk.
the customers as well.
And their customers.
Yeah.
Right? So now climate leadership, or at least acknowledging that you have a plan for doing something in and around climate, is a question of, one, should we identify some risk? And the flip side of risk is that there's uncertainty. So the reason businesses can show some sort of leadership in this space is that they're not obligated to publish like a peer-reviewed publication saying, this is exactly the emission trajectory we're on. This is exactly how atmospheric dynamics play out. They just saying, this could happen. And if this could happen and it takes this form or that form, we should be prepared for that. We're going to assign a probability to that, but we're not making a firm prediction, which is a very nice luxury they have, say, compared to like an IPCC, which tries to make as accurate a prediction about what is happening as possible.
Right.
So the attitude that business just takes is one of risk, because we're always dealing with risk. Risk is how we manage all of our operations.
So I was at Globe 2020 here in Vancouver a couple of weeks ago. And I became aware of the fact that CocaCola, this huge international bottling company, was making a pledge to reduce its reliance on virgin plastic to a fraction of what it is now by 2030. And the answer is, well, can you do it? Or is it just the fact that they've made the pledge to move in that direction enough that they now start to meet all those same objectives that we just talked about?
It's an interesting question, because is 2030 soon enough to be measurable, right? So in business, we always like specific, measurable, actionable, relevant, and timely goals. So I'll give them credit for only being a decade, because I see, for example, a lot of other companies right now making goals for 2050.
Yeah.
And I was like, well, that is just, you're just trying to buy time. If you're trying to make a goal for 2050, no one's going to measure your performance there. But another company that I'd use to compare to Coca-Cola, Adidas. So Adidas has made a claim, a commitment to, by 2024, source all of the plastic in their clothes and shoes, which is a lot of synthetic fiber, from ocean plastic. And so you would think, well, this is impossible. They're not going to do this. Where's the feedstock? Well, the reality is they have a line of sneakers called the Parlay line, which are already made of ocean plastic, where they've devised systems for recovering plastic from the ocean and grinding it up and turning it into a filament, which then you can make into a shirt or a shoe or whatever you need.
Right.
And they're just figuring out how to build up that supply chain and then scale it. So I would argue that Coke actually is going to be able to achieve what they're trying to do by moving away from virgin plastic.
Well, I think they've got a bigger challenge, because to make a sneaker or a shirt, you're not making a food-related product. And to use post-consumer plastic, as I understand, to get it so that it is going to be at food grade, really challenging. And you're probably never going to get to medical grade plastics using recycled plastics. And so these are all some of the considerations that have to come into play.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not here I couldn't speak specifically to Coke's strategy, but what I would say is that they're trying to make a commitment which buys them time.
Yeah.
They're trying, I suspect that there are earnest efforts internally to actually figure out how would we meet this goal. I know they've made commitments in the past to say, well, we can't get virgin plastic, but could we get bioplastic? And so they were making bottles out of sugarcane and other kinds of biologically derived plastics as opposed to fossil fuel derived plastics. I suspect in the long run, they'll actually find it easier to carry down that path, say using bioplastics derived from forest products rather than just agricultural products like corn, which puts pressure on food systems. It's much easier for them to put pressure on forest-based systems. It has less negative unintended consequences on food prices by moving our packaging system from food as opposed to deriving it all from wood. So, but that's a big, complicated thing. And honestly, I don't actually think it's climate leadership. I mean, Coke, the worst thing about Coke is what's in the bottle. It's not the package.
Right.
And yet, they're really smart about shifting our conversation away. And I think this is very timely because we just saw in the BC provincial budget just this past week a new tax on carbonated sugary drinks. So there's some acknowledgement in some jurisdictions that actually the bad thing about a bottle of Coke is probably the long-term health effects it's having, that we have a corn syrup-based economy for a lot of people. And that especially lower-income people are eating such unhealthy food, and that we have indirectly subsidized a lot of that. So that's a whole other conversation. But making the conversation around the bottle for Coke, they'd love to have that conversation. Much better conversation to have than what their core business model is, which is selling people something that's fundamentally unhealthy for them.
Right. Yet, they have to, as we, the point of this conversation is to say, well, what are the consequences of not moving in that direction? And the consequences are that there's going to be a piling on about the discussion about that organization. And then at some point, it starts to make it more challenging for them to attract the kind of human resources that they need. And so, you take a look at, let's say, HSBC Bank Canada. I know they have an incredibly high commitment to water, and they see this as a responsibility that they have in addressing climate issues. And there's a whole host of reasons why. And one of those would be, how do the people who work for us identify with the organization that they get their paycheck from?
Yeah. I think you're leading into this broader question of what I like to frame as access. You want access to talent. You want access to capital. You want access to markets. You want access to customers. You better figure out how you're going to be more sustainable. I was speaking recently with a senior executive in a very large super major energy company who's like, we're really struggling actually to recruit the right engineers. They want to go work for Google. They want to go work for Apple. They want to go work for a company that's saying we're going to be carbon neutral by 2030. They want to work for a company that feels more in line with their values. We're having a harder time finding the best and brightest coming to work for them. Now suddenly we're starting to see this trickle into the investment atmosphere. I think you could look at Larry Fink, CEO of BlackRock, who recently just said, we're not going to invest in companies that don't have a climate leadership plan. We are really going to start using environmental, social, and governance indicators as a screening criteria for who we put money into. And yeah, right now they're straddling an awkward phase where they have money in coal-powered utility operators, as well as trying to think more progressively about climate. But in the long run, we're seeing early indicators that financial markets are going to be a major driver in this access space too. So showing leadership gets you better employees, gets you better financial options. It gets you ahead of the curve in terms of what the government's coming to do. Because one way or the other, whatever the conversation in Canada is interesting, but sometimes in Canada we forget how small we are. Yes. And how carbon pricing or in the EU could be just as influential as a carbon tax internally. Or obviously I think there's a lot of perhaps despondency about what's happening south of the border around climate, but it may happen that China, for example, starts looking for carbon pricing or at least transparency around carbon. Same thing as Japan. There's a lot of jurisdictions, the majority of political jurisdictions in the world, who are looking at regulatory mechanisms for pricing this. And so you might as well set yourself up to be successful because it's less painful the earlier you start.
Right.
And I'll use Microsoft as an example. So they were able to recently make this commitment to going carbon neutral by 2030. But that is built on a program that's almost 10 years old now where they set an internal price on carbon. They said, let's just get a sense of what our footprint is. Let's figure out, is it employee travel? Is it maintaining our offices? Is it buying new equipment? Is it embodied carbon in the computers we buy? Or is it operating our data centers? Let's price that, because then we can manage it, and then we can figure out what putting systems and procedures and process in place. But the longer you try and avoid that, the more painful and difficult showing leadership in this space becomes.
Yeah, Microsoft could even start to say, well, how processor intensive is running our program, and what does that do to the power draw on the computers that use Microsoft products?
And they inherently, the beautiful thing about technology and why they're able to almost rest on their laurels a little bit in this space is that inherently you want an app that uses less energy because it's less processor intensive, and then therefore the battery either lasts longer or you can create an app that becomes more powerful. So they have a built-in incentive for using less energy and thus emitting less carbon.
Right.
Which other sectors of the economy obviously don't have that same level of built-in incentive or that sort of built-in, baked-in technological trend that we see happening in big companies.
So now let's remember, they are south of the border. I mean, you touched on the point that, we take a look at what's happening south of the border, but you're really looking only at the the posturing of an administration. I think that, the announcement by Jeff Bezos the other day. So he's a perfect example of a business that's saying, okay, we're a pretty carbon intensive business, and he much more so than Microsoft because he is delivering products.
Yeah.
And he's now saying, I'm going to take $10 billion of my own money and put it into reducing our, climate impact. Is this a smart move on his behalf, and will it make an effect? So is it an investment in actually making an effect, or is it an investment in saying, look at us, look at how good we are?
So you touch on this really interesting, deeper point, which is that in the absence of meaning federal leadership in the United States, what's ended up happening is that municipalities, states, and the private sector have become the leaders in the climate space.
Yeah.
So they're like, if the EPA is not going to regulate CO2 as a pollutant, we're going to figure out something to do on our own. So now Bezos is an interesting one because he obviously has 110 million, I believe, Prime subscribers right now. And those Prime subscribers, one of the things that they understand intuitively is a truck comes to my house every day.
Yeah.
A box shows up on my front porch. It's often half empty with a bunch of plastic packaging. What's the carbon footprint of everything I'm doing? So maybe Bezos is buying some moral license for his customers. Maybe he's doing some smart PR move here by saying, look, Amazon can't be that bad. They're putting $10 billion into a climate fund. Maybe that's what's happening. That's a cynical view, but I can appreciate it because one should be cynical, or at least skeptical of the choices of the world's richest people. On the other hand, Bezos might be looking at climate and saying, look, I want my business to be able to make money reliably and predictably for decades.
Yes.
And part of that is maintaining relative balance in our ecosystems. I don't want too much extreme weather. I don't want crop zones to change. I don't want there to be an increase in frequency of extreme events in the Pacific or the South or in the Gulf of Mexico. I like my supply chains to operate on time. I like sea levels where they are. I don't want ports to have to rebuild or relocate. I'd like the city of Miami to continue to be able to pay their mortgage, because when they pay their mortgage, they can buy stuff from me. But if the city of Miami ends up underwater, I might lose some customers. Not a great deal for me. So maybe he's just thinking, this is my altruistic contribution.
I give to get.
Yeah. And then there's a third way we could look at it, which is that if we recognize that if we recognize there's a problem, and if we recognize that business is going to play a role in solving this problem, if you are out ahead in solving this problem, you're going to capture the market. If you're the one who brings, I think, I can't remember who was the quote, whether it's Gates or Bezos, it was somebody, I think it was Gates, who said the world's first trillionaire is going to be the person who solves climate.
Oh, I thought he said world's first trillionaire is the person who solves a $1 trillion problem.
Well, the climate is a $1 trillion problem.
Yeah.
And so Bezos may be saying, hey, through my climate fund, I can actually be taking, because there's ways to structure foundations where rather than just they're not just charitable entities.
Right.
Foundations can invest in companies.
They become self-perpetuating.
They can become a vehicle for making investments in startups or in clean energy startups, whatever it might be.
Which is what Gates is doing now.
Through the gate, exactly. So I don't know what his $10 billion foundation, whether it's an ego project, whether it's a moral licensing project for his customers, whether it's a risk mitigation project for managing the stability of his business, or whether he just thinks it's the right thing to do. I mean, it would be a question that someone should aggressively pose to him.
Well, as we talk about, the van shows up and drops off the package, but if that same van stops at 8 houses down the road and drops off packages at each one of those places, there's 8 individual trips from those homes that didn't take place.
Exactly.
So there's already an environmental footprint just by having it brought to you rather than everybody going to go get it at the store.
It's a classic reason why people were trying to figure out when the Netflix was a DVD model versus a streaming model, and someone was saying, which one has the larger environmental footprint? And like all of these questions in sustainability, it depends. So
it depends, and that is the answer.
So if you leave your home and drive 10 kilometers to go to a Blockbuster and rent a DVD, and then drive home and watch it, and the next day drive home and drop it off at the Blockbuster, you've got 40 kilometers of travel associated with that DVD, and by far it's the worst.
Yeah.
But let's say there's a Blockbuster next door to your work, and on the way home on your bike, you stop in, you grab some popcorn and a DVD, and then you end up home. Suddenly the DVD's footprint could be smaller than actually streaming 4 gigabytes of data over the internet. It all depends. Is the DVD getting used once? Is it getting used 10 times? Right? There's all these interesting questions that you have to work your way through. And so with Amazon, how full is the truck? How optimized is the delivery network? How far does the product have to go? Are you in an urban municipality like Vancouver, where it's really easy for an Amazon truck to just drive all day full of packages, and et cetera, et cetera? Or are you somewhere rural where they have to make a long trip just to get to your house at the end of a long lane?
Right. It depends.
Last mile transportation oftentimes is one of the largest sources of GHGs associated with the delivery of a product. It's not actually, everyone likes to talk about, oh, we shouldn't import goods from China, or we're making things overseas, and who think about all the energy used in putting a TV on a shipping container and sending it from Shanghai to Vancouver. I was like, that is not the major energy contributor here. It's how you got to Best Buy.
Yes.
It's how you got there that makes
how you got it home.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I had an interesting conversation with Mark Jacquard a couple of years ago where he said, we look at governments and they want to bring in legislation. He said that is a cumbersome, very difficult, and ineffective way about changing the legislative landscape. He said it's much better to just come along and change a regulation. From now on you want to sell that pump and that motor, it now needs to be to these specs. You set the standard and then industry responds. Okay, that makes sense. But that's still saying this is leaving it up to government. And we're talking about what the role of companies is. When it comes to changing the way in which we're going to address all these issues that can reduce our footprint in the world. And I want to take it away from just CO2, because I think, the interconnectedness of the environment as a whole is something that we have to pay attention to. You can't just say, oh, it's just the atmospheric gases. No, it's everything. And I believe that companies, and by extension their customers, have to take on a responsibility. So now here's the interesting rub, and I know you and I had this conversation off camera before. So whose responsibility is it? Do we dump it on the customer, or do we dump it back on the corporation and government?
Yeah.
Who is responsible?
So you're asking like one of these fundamental questions that the private sector is actually struggling with, because much of the way that organizations operate today and the way they're governed and regulated is grounded around the idea that the primary responsibility of a company is to maximize shareholder value. Right? That's Milton Friedman, that's the University of Chicago, that's the old school definition.
We're in the business of making money.
We're in the business of making money. But the thing that everyone forgets is that after that it says, as long as they're following the rules of the game. Here's the interesting thing that I think we're dealing with in the 2010s, 2020s is the rules of the game. What if they're not actually aligned with the crises that we're facing? What if government policy is not sufficiently urgent in order to pricing carbon? What if it's not doing a good enough job at figuring out what is the cumulative effect of all of this industrial activity on all sorts of ecosystems, not just CO2 in the atmosphere, but our overall sort of drawdown of natural capital. Right? If you think of the planet as a bank account, we're just taking money out on a constant basis with returning very little. So there's that component. The other component is that when Friedman articulated that idea, governments were large and powerful, and companies tended to be mostly domestic. Companies tended to, maybe they're Western European countries, North American companies, just a Canadian or an American company. Now companies are massive monoliths. If you look at the list of the 100 largest economic organizations in the world, either comparing how much GDP has a country collected or how much revenue did a company collect.
Yeah, right.
70 of the top 100 are now multinational corporations. So yes, Friedman is right that the primary responsibility of those companies is to maximize shareholder value as long as they're playing by the rules of the game. But they're now so big.
What are the rules of the game
They're now so big that they can skirt around the rules of the game.
Right.
Oh, you're going to put an aggressive carbon tax here. Well, maybe I'll locate a little more of my operations over here.
Yeah, we're going to go to Ireland. We're going to be in China. And then when the rules change there, they go somewhere else.
So what we have to do is shift, I think, the conversation of responsibility away from, okay, are you responsible for correcting, for admitting to your sins and resolving them in some way? Let's say if you as a company create a negative externality, if your activities somehow deplete natural capital, are you paying for that? That's our traditional economic view.
Yeah.
But I like to talk about sustainability and climate much more from an innovation perspective, where it's like if you're the Canadian forest products firm that figures out how to solve Amazon's packaging problem, if you're the Canadian forest products firm that invests enough R&D, not in your traditional manufacturing processes, but in solving Coke's bottled water problem, You solve their virgin fiber problem. You use climate as a lens to identify and implement innovation opportunity.
Okay.
Your responsibility to shareholders is to pursue that.
Right.
It's not to just say, this is the status quo. This is the way, I'm a forest products company. Don't ask me to think what I do with my black liquor and my pulp mill. Right? It's like, well, actually, we want you to think a little more aggressively of what you could be doing with some of the byproducts from pulp and paper manufacturing, because we think you could be going to Coke and saying, you've got a big commitment. I've got your solution.
Okay, so this raises the question, does this focus on climate? And there are people who go, oh my gosh, it's a tax, it is going to stifle, if not kill, the economy.
Yeah.
And that's one view of it. Mm-hmm. But the other side, and I look at it and go, but doesn't it create even more opportunities? So is there not an economic opportunity in addressing these issues, whether you believe the science to be real or not?
Yeah.
You still start to address that issue, and everything else improves as a result of it, including your bank account.
Yeah.
Can we not look at this as a great economic opportunity?
Yeah, so it's like there's this classic cartoon that goes around. So it's like, so we cleaned our air and made our energy efficient systems more efficient, and we made cleaner cars, and we made more livable cities, and we stopped digging up stuff from under the ground. And it was all for nothing. We just made our world a better place. This is what we're stuck on, right? So this is a paradigm. People are stuck on that. Solving environmental problems has to just be a source of cost.
Okay, you said something that just triggered something in me, though. You said when we stop digging up stuff from under the ground. I don't know that we can ever stop digging up stuff from under the ground, because all of these things have to be made from something. They have to come from a material. And interestingly enough, I think the mining and resource sector, there's going to be more pressure on it to dig more stuff up from under the ground.
Well, it's really interesting because we're going to have to get better at being more efficient when we do dig.
Yes.
Better at managing the negative consequences of when we do dig. We're going to have to get better at recovering utility out of existing material chains. So like the aluminum industry is one that's a fantastic example, where I think it's something close to 75% of all aluminum ever produced has been recycled.
Yeah.
And it's still in use.
Yeah.
So there's a really good proof of concept of this idea of a circular economy. So yeah, you need flows, but you want to manage the stock as efficiently as possible.
I was just talking to a guy earlier today who was talking about Gen 4 nuclear.
Yeah.
And he said, well, one of the biggest sources of the fuel that you would need would be what's considered to be nuclear waste today.
Yeah.
It's sitting there, and he says it's an untapped gold mine now.
Turn waste into an opportunity. This idea of waste, we have to recognize that humans invented the idea of waste.
Yes.
It's not in nature, there's no waste.
Well, natural gas is a perfect example of it. When they first started to discover it, they went, what's this stuff? And they burnt it off.
In a large part, that's what's happening to this day in northeastern British Columbia, where we have excess natural gas, which we're flaring in order to get condensate and ship it into northeastern Alberta.
Right.
But I want to think about this sort of transition that we're in. There's this one other story that I think really helps us understand the challenge here. It's like, if these people, let's say it was 100 years ago, and people were proposing that we put a tax on horse manure.
Yes.
And the big challenge in urban centers around the world was an excess of horse manure. And the New York Times was putting out these hysterical op-eds saying that if trends continue as they do, we're going to have 2 feet of horse manure across all of New York City, and no one's going to be able to get around. And this is the biggest environmental crisis of our time. 10 years later, the Model T comes along.
Right.
Horse ownership in urban environments plunges.
Yes.
So you had a solution to a problem which not only solved the problem, but made things way better.
Well,
right?
The introduction of the smartphone, eliminated a whole bunch of other devices that aren't being made any longer.
So when we're looking at this lens of sustainability and innovation and the responsibility of companies to be playing this, it's because we're in the midst of an industrial transformation. One of these things that happens every couple generations, where the underlying expectations of society in terms of what are you delivering in terms of value, the expectations of government are changing, investors are changing. Companies have the opportunity, if you're looking at this is a risk I need to manage, and how do I get all these environmentalists off my back?
Right.
Or how do I find the way to win this future? Right. How do I figure out, there's this massive new demand coming for lithium because all of these electric vehicles and battery storage systems are being powered by lithium. And so now there's companies in Alberta, for example, are realizing that their existing hydraulic fracturing technology and a lot of their existing wells contain a saline solution which is heavy with lithium.
Yes.
And so it's like, well, maybe we should stop just thinking of ourselves as a oil and gas company and start thinking of ourselves as an energy company.
Yeah.
And we're indifferent to the energy market that we're serving. Let's detach ourselves from this story that all we do is remove petroleum products from the ground, and attach ourselves to a new story, which is we're an energy company.
Yeah.
And so Shell, for example, used to call themselves an oil and gas company. Now they call themselves a gas and oil company. And in the future, they're just going to call themselves an energy company.
Yeah.
Because that's this business that they're in at the end of the day.
I was listening to Axel Meisner, I think, from Innovate Alberta. And he said, okay, so there is an appetite to, restrict the movement of oil from the oil sands in Alberta to be used as a fossil fuel. Well, what else could it be used for? It doesn't mean that it doesn't have a use.
Sure.
And apparently it is ideal for the making of medical grade plastics and tennis rackets and the cover for your phone and so on. Well, managed properly, is that an appropriate use? But it goes to show, okay, well, there are other issues that need to be addressed, and if we put our collective intelligence to this, we can find ways to do it that will hopefully continue to be better for the environment and better for the, overall quality of life that we get to enjoy.
Yeah. The thing that I think Alberta would struggle with is like, well, how many hundreds of thousands of barrels of oil per day do we move through our network and get to what they want to do is get to tide market, but even just to domestic or American markets versus what's the overall demand for a medical grade plastic. So the hardest question is you can never go to a CEO of a company and be like, okay, we'd like for you to put in a plan for shrinking your company, please. Dear, CEO of Suncor, what's your vision for producing 1/5 as much oil by 2030 as you produce right now? They can't articulate that vision.
No.
There's nothing in our economic system right now that would ever reward them for doing that.
Yeah.
So this is the danger. So as citizens and as governments, we can have that vision. Yeah. It's much harder as a CEO of a company to have that vision in terms of how do we change how we produce value. But it does mean that that oil and those sands and that resource is not without value. It's just what people want and where it's coming from might change.
Yes. Well, after this 30-minute conversation, we come around to if you don't pay attention to this, you are going to see the size of your company diminish anyways because you didn't have a plan to address this. And these are the pressing issues of our time. We have to pay attention to it.
Yeah, I'll leave you with sort of one final idea that I think is particularly important in the natural resource sector in Canada. It's this notion that comes out of economics of stranded assets. So a stranded asset is something that we used to think have value, but was prematurely written down because of some change in circumstance.
Right.
So 10 years ago, we probably would have thought that a Blockbuster video was very valuable. And then suddenly some new technology came along that not only made it slightly better, it made it 10 times better than the traditional delivery model. And all of those leaseholders, those people who rented Blockbuster, either owned a Blockbuster franchise or leased a retail space to Blockbuster, were left with a stranded asset. We're seeing across the United States right now a retail apocalypse. We're seeing malls where consumer habits and expectations and investors are all so rapidly changing that these malls are being stranded.
Right.
In the EU, we saw a massive stranding of assets in the coal sector.
Yes.
Where within the course of 10 years, all of these energy utilities that felt like they were going to be building out their coal capacity, they were going to be growing the economy was going to grow, we're going to serve it with coal. Suddenly they found a much more competitive energy market where natural gas from Russia was coming in, and they found that renewables suddenly started with initial price support, but then scale, becoming cost competitive with coal across the board. And suddenly, you see somewhere between 50 and 70% of the book value of those companies becoming stranded assets. And so this is the hardest question that confronts particularly the Canadian energy industry, is that if you look at a lot of their assets, and the oil sands in particular, these projects require long lifespans in order to be economically viable. Right? They require 30, 40 years in order to get the kind of return that we need. If we want Trans Mountain Pipeline to be economically viable, it has to run for quite a good deal of time in order to justify this cumulative $16 billion that the Canadian taxpayer is going to pay in order to construct that.
Right.
That requires certainty and predictability about energy markets that last for at least 20 years. Now, with the iPhone being 11 years old, with Tesla going from nothing to the second largest automaker in the world in a matter of minutes, in a matter of a decade, pardon me, with the largest companies in the world now across the board all being tech companies.
Yeah.
I would say that assuming that this pace of change and that the urgency of doing something around climate and that the effect that these large investors and large companies are having in terms of bringing technology to market, to assume that's going to slow down and that somehow that the last decade is just a blip on the radar and the 2020s are going to be a return to normal is insane.
Yes.
And it's going to result in a lot of stranded assets where people are going to have invested billions of dollars in assets where the economic case for managing that asset no longer exists.
Okay.
And so the CEO of Shell is on the record themselves for saying, we think that we are either have reached or are close to reaching peak gasoline. And so what he means by that is not that the fossil fuel economy is going to go away overnight.
No.
He's just saying that we think we're not going to sell any more gas next year than
Than we
did
are this year. Yeah.
And that we better figure out how we get into the natural gas and the LNG industry, or how to get into the solar industry, or the energy storage industry, or whatever other industry.
Which they're already doing.
Which they're because they are showing leadership in the space.
Right.
If you aren't confronting your business model with the question of what's peak for us, not peak in terms of we run out of oil to drill, but peak in terms of we run out of markets to sell to. It's a really challenging question for our Canadian energy assets in particular because of their uniquely capital intensive and they have uniquely long lifespans.
Okay, is that ending on a positive note or a cautionary or a depressing note?
I think
because I have this tendency to go, okay, I hear you, but out of every stranded asset, somebody else is going to find an opportunity.
Exactly. Yeah.
They're going to say, oh, hang on a second. This is what we can do with that. I did an interview with a guy last year who was talking about, we've discovered this asset of cobalt in, eastern Ontario, Quebec, that was discarded material because at the time it was considered to be worthless.
And now
like there are deposits of what's the next thing that we need around us, and maybe they come out of those stranded assets. They're repurposed. This is where coming back to your point about innovation.
Yeah.
I want to believe that we find these answers.
I think at the end of the day,
and that business plays a fundamentally important role because that's where innovators go.
Yeah, I think business plays a fundamental role. Two, I think you should view it positively. I think there might be people or small companies or providers who think, how could I operate in this new world? But in 1905, when horses were going out of control and cities were swamped in horse manure, at some point in time, horse breeders became a stranded asset.
Yes.
And we figured it out.
And blacksmiths went away, primarily, or mostly.
And so I think it shows leadership, whether it's a CEO or whether it's a premier, shows leadership by saying, hey, we recognize that there is a finite game we're playing here in this particular economy. And what was really fascinating is that I noticed for the first time that Jason Kenney just a couple weeks ago said, yeah, we understand that there's a transition underway.
Yes.
24 months ago, that was politically unpalatable.
Right.
Untouchable idea for Premier of Alberta to say, we think that there might be a sunset clause on this industry.
Well, we've been in the transition for more than 20 years already.
Yeah, and so this is where this is what kills me because one of the graphs that I think is most interesting is to look at 1990 and compare the sovereign wealth funds of either the province of Alberta and Norway. So in 1990, they were the same size. Alberta's was actually a little bit bigger.
Yeah.
And those oil economies created just about as much surplus value over that 30-year period of time. Except in one jurisdiction, all of that surplus value was just returned back to consumers. And in another jurisdiction, it was used to build up a massive sovereign wealth fund, which is now investing in the next transition. That is a damning graph when you look at how you could prepare yourself for this. And so it also is evidence that the longer you wait to respond to the climate crisis, the longer you wait to think about sustainability as not just a risk to be managed, but an innovation opportunity, the more painful it's going to be for you, and the less likely that you're going to get to participate in any of the upside.
So look at it as an opportunity by addressing the changes.
Exactly.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, you're welcome. Thank you.
That was great. See you next time.